Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 29th of June 1924, politicians look some infrastructure gift horses in the mouth. But first, some of the other items that have caught my attention this week. The Democratic Convention has opened in New York. Spoiler alert, choosing a presidential candidate is going to involve a lot of effort, and that effort will be entirely wasted. In the 5th of August 1923 episode, I mentioned the travails of Cross and Blackwell. Traditionally, they have been producers of sugary products, but sugar is highly taxed, so they have been in difficulties. A year ago they decided to sell a pickle, not made with sugar, named after their factory in Branston. So has this wonder product, that has been a feature of every Briton's life since, turned things around? No. The company is undergoing restructuring, and the Branston factory is being closed. Branston Pickle didn't even merit a mention at the company's annual general meeting. The Times this week published a review of the Bentley 3 litre, which was first sold in 1921. Better late than never, I suppose. Especially given that Bentley will, spoiler alert, go bust in 7 years' time. The car they reviewed had 20,000 miles on the clock, which suggests it wasn't exactly new. It also suggests that car manufacturers were less inclined to lend cars for review in those days. By the way, they liked it. The Wimbledon tennis tournament is underway. It has been announced that the appeal to save HMS Victory, which I haven't previously mentioned, has been successful. Last week I mentioned that the Empire exhibition at Wembley was holding a rodeo, and that this had not gone down well with the animal rights lobby. It really hadn't. The summonses against Charles B. Cochrane, the promoter, and Tex Austin, the director and manager, charged them with having unlawfully kept a place for the purpose of fighting certain animals, to wit steers, and with having unlawfully caused to be cruelly ill-treated certain animals on June 14th, 18th, and 19th. 5 cowboys, James Richard Hunton, Charles Irwin, Guy Schultz, Powder River Thompson, and Ad Eddins, were summoned for cruelty to steers on various days, and a timekeeper, G.H. Johnston, was summoned for aiding and abetting. Steer to me sounds American, so I decided to look it up. It means bullock, and the term is not normally used on this side of the Atlantic, but it was then. It's not alone. Plenty of people in those days put initials in their names, and the Times used Z to I's words rather than S. Why? Why would you do that? I think it is an attempt, perhaps even a subconscious attempt, to distinguish Britain from its bigger and more successful brother. The exhibition has also made enemies among the thesps. The London theatres thought that it would be a good deal for them, with people coming to London for the exhibition and staying to take in a show. Unfortunately, in many cases people who would otherwise have gone to a show have instead gone to the exhibition. Saturday marked 10 years since the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife in Sarajevo. The Times has marked the event by publishing extracts from the paper of the time. I think we can expect a lot more of that over the course of the next month. Friday brought a bit of karma. Albert George Bowes, who wounded Sir Edward Henry, then Commissioner of Police in London, in 1913, actually 1912, ran amok at Rossburg, Florida, on June the 10th, and was shot dead by a sheriff. Henry had turned down Bowes's application for a taxi licence. Rightly so, it would appear. In Italy there have been no major developments in the Matteotti investigation. Giacomo Matteotti was a socialist politician, abducted and presumably killed by fascists, apparently without Mussolini's direction or knowledge. On Tuesday, the Times reported on trouble in Turin. Fascisti held a meeting in the Balbo Theatre yesterday. After the meeting, a strong column of fascisti tried to storm the offices of the Stampa, but were driven back by the Carabinieri. At the same time, some fascisti in a motorcar raided the private residence of Senator Frassati, proprietor and editor of the Stampa. The senator was out of town, but his wife and his son, a young student, were indoors. The fascisti began breaking up the furniture, but the young Frassati succeeded in disarming one of the assailants, and finally they left. Brave man. Just for fun, I thought I'd see if the internet knew anything about him. It did. He, Pier Giorgio Frassati, will die next year of polio, and in 1990 he will be beatified. Not for this incident, as it happens, but his charitable work. Next year, i.e. 2025, he will become a saint. On Thursday, the Times published an editorial reflecting on a speech Mussolini had made to the Italian Senate. The Senate, we are told, received Signor Mussolini's speech of Monday with a coldness which savoured of indifference. The telegraphic reports show that Mussolini stood firmly by the doctrine and by the policy he has consistently proclaimed since he seized upon power. He comes before the Senate and before the world on the defensive, but with no bated breath or whispering humbleness. He treats with contempt the suggestion that fascismo has been crushed by the Matteotti murder and the storm which has followed it. The movement, he declares, has profited by them, and will profit by them further by ridding itself of its bad elements. It's interesting to note that a certain mustachioed German dictator had similar problems with his supporters. At school I was taught that the key outcome of Matteotti's assassination was that the opposition boycotted Parliament. I am beginning to think that the key outcome was that it allowed Mussolini the excuse to gain full or fuller control over his party. The Times goes on to talk about sham elections. Votes in the conditions of terrorism, which he deliberately encouraged, proved nothing but the efficacy of the terror. This is quite a long way away from what the Times was writing in the immediate aftermath of those sham elections, as featured in the 13th of April 1924 episode. It would appear that the penny has dropped in Printing House Square. And now one for the First World War nerds out there. The classic text when it comes to the origins of the war is Luigi Albertini's 3-volume The Origins of the War of 1914. Published posthumously in 1942, its author had the advantage that a lot of the participants were still alive, and that the archives had yet to be destroyed in Allied air raids. But before Albertini turned historian, he was the editor of the Corriere della Sera and an Italian senator. To him fell the task of replying to Mussolini. The spokesman of the opposition had an easy task in exposing the excesses of the fascist regime, the robberies and the deeds of violence perpetrated by fascists, the fortunes some suddenly acquired by illicit means, and the impunity before the law which too many have enjoyed. It also says this: Signor Albertini acknowledges that fascismo has done some good work. Your occasional reminder that fascism rose in response to the rise of communism. See the 29th of October 1922 episode. The Channel Tunnel was first opened in 1994, but there had been schemes proposed in 1881, the early 1970s, just before the First World War, and 1924. On Friday, the Times reported on a delegation that had visited the Prime Minister, Ramsay MacDonald, in support of the proposal. Mrs. Wintringham, the second ever woman MP, no less, urged the construction of the tunnel, in order to remove what had been a perpetual barrier against the greater friendship and understanding between England and France, which would come with easier communication. Is that true? Have we seen greater friendship and understanding between England and France since 1994? Given that the only major political developments since that time are the migrant crisis and Brexit, I'd have to say no. Mr. Foote, urged that the arguments in favour of the tunnel had been very much strengthened and those against it very much weakened by what had happened during the last 10 or 20 years. The tunnel would have been extremely useful during the war. The Prime Minister said that they must all admit that circumstances had changed very much in reference to questions of strategy within the last few years. The whole question would have to be very carefully considered from a practical and detailed point of view. He had therefore summoned a special meeting of the Committee of Imperial Defence for next week to consider the matter and report to him about it. The delegation came armed with a memorandum. Should the scheme be decided upon, one estimate given in the memorandum is that work would be provided for 24,000 men, 12,000 in this country and 12,000 in France, for nearly 5 years. The estimated cost is £29 million, which would buy you 6.4 million ounces of gold. The total cost of the tunnel that actually got built was £9 billion. In 1994, gold was about $400 an ounce, and the pound was worth $1.50. So gold was about £266 an ounce, and therefore the cost of the tunnel was 34 million ounces. That's quite the price hike. Mind you, I don't think the tunnel of 1924 would have had an escape tunnel in the middle, or was designed for a 100-mile-an-hour operation. I should state that I'm not entirely comfortable with that calculation. It assumes that every penny was spent on one day in 1994, when clearly it was spent over a number of years, with varying exchange rates between the pound and gold. In regard to raising the necessary capital, the memorandum declares that no difficulty need be anticipated on the point, assuming that definite support is given to the scheme by the British government. It even talks about an immediate return of 8%. They were similarly bullish in the 1980s. The way I remember it was that Eurotunnel, the builders, were in constant financial trouble. This is not the only bit of private infrastructure under consideration. In the 23rd of December 1923 episode, I mentioned the plans to build a privately owned motorway between London and Liverpool. The railways, not entirely surprisingly, are not happy. This is a letter from Hugh Miller, editor of Roads and Roads Construction. They, the railways, both depreciate the possibility of the commercial success of the proposed motorway, and at the same time they evidently fear it. The 1920s equivalent of, this NATO weapon won't work and will represent a serious escalation. They complain that they are by far the largest individual ratepayers, and so are assisting to subsidise road transport. Yet they object to the construction of a road which will be assisted neither by contributions from the rates nor the road fund. The objection is not logical. The danger that the railways can foresee in the construction of such a road is that the public would become educated to the enormous possibilities of the road in providing economical transport. Odd how the roles have been reversed. Nowadays it is road subsidising rail. It is quite true that at present only such traffic as is carried by the railway companies at the higher rates is carried by road. This is due purely to the inadequacy of existing roads. But if roads are built on the lines proposed by the promoters of the Northern and Western Motorway, the cost of road transport will be so much reduced that lower grade traffic may be carried with advantage. With regard to highly developed road transport, it is quite possible to carry goods at as little as 1 penny to 1.5 pence per ton-mile, including the cost and maintenance charges of the road. This compares favourably with rail transport when terminal charges and handling costs are taken into consideration. Shortly after the Second World War, Britain's railways were nationalised. In the early 1950s, if memory serves, they started to lose money. This was not all down to nationalisation. A lot of it was the loss of markets to road transport, and this was before the first motorways were built. By the 1960s the position was desperate, and a huge amount of the network was closed down. But, it would appear, the writing was on the wall much earlier. Miller then says this: 50 and even 100-ton loads might be hauled. Actually they won't. The highest load, normal load on British roads is 44 tons, or, well, metric tons anyway. Motor roads are inevitable, and they will be constructed just as soon as the public realises their economic value and advantages such as door-to-door delivery, minimum packing, and practically no delay. So, in the 1920s we could have had a Channel Tunnel and a London to Liverpool motorway without the taxpayer having to pay a penny. And we got neither. The Channel Tunnel wasn't opened until, as I said, 1994, and the London to Liverpool motorway until the 1970s. Anyway, that's all for this week. I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.